Hello, I'm Tony Guida. This is My New York. From the Oval Office, almost daily, Donald Trump vilifies the press as corrupt, stupid, purveyors of fake news, and the enemy of the people. Alarming? Yes. Unprecedented? Hardly. The president's versus the press reminds us that battle began with George Washington, even saw Abe Lincoln throw journalists in jail, and it rages on as fiercely as ever. The book is the latest work from Harold Holzer, preeminent Lincoln scholar, presidential historian, and now director of the Roosevelt House Public Policy Institute at Hunter College. Harold Holzer and his spirited book. Next. Harold Holzer, how good to see you. Welcome back to the program.
Thanks. Great to be with you, Tony.
This book is such a lively, spirited history of presidents condemning, disparaging, going around the press from George Washington on down. Yet you say Trump is the gravest threat. President Trump is the gravest threat to press freedom in American history. How so?
Well, in a way, he is, because of the constant drip, drip, drip of his ascetic kind of comments about fake news in general being the enemies of the people. That's a new one, and that's a line right out of Goebbels and Stalin. Certainly presidential criticism of the press criticism of the president goes back to George Washington, and indignation goes back to George Washington. But the carelessness with the truth and the condemnation of criticism as sedition, we haven't seen that since John Adams.
Who put journalists on trial.
He did. He's I think was in a way the gravest threat, except in the end it extended only to 17 journalists. But Adams signed a law making it a federal crime to ridicule the president of the United States. And under that edict, anti-federalist editors were fined, put in prison. Their publications were ceased. And there was no war, no terrorism, no excuse except that Adams was thin-skinned and didn't want to be criticized. That, I think, was still the worst abuse. For all of his bark, Trump, I think, lacks bite.
How?
Well, I think he treats critical journalism like he treats the coronavirus. It's very inconvenient, but he doesn't quite know how to organize to fight it. And the fact that he's disorganized has helped keep the press vibrant, even in the wake of his attempt to rally, his what we could assume to be his half of the country, into question objective truth. That's the threat we face now.
There's an interesting dynamic we see with him that we've seen with other presidents, which is despite their animus towards the press, towards the media, they seem to be drawn to the flame. They need to touch the flame, as somebody just recently said about Trump, because of his conversations, which he allowed to be recorded, with Bob Woodward. And he's not the only one who needed to touch the flame.
No, they all think they can dominate the press. They all think they can prevail at news conferences, and they have different ways of doing it. Ronald Reagan used to memorize the questions and the answers as if he was back in Hollywood committing a script to memory. George W. Bush did intense preparation. John Kennedy, who inaugurated television news conferences as theater, sat with advisors for breakfast, Ted Sorensen, Pierre Salinger, the State Department, and then he would continue rehearsing through the day, and his advisors would be with him in the bedroom when he got dressed to still throw questions at him. So all of his ease, his naturalness, was the result of intense rehearsal. But Trump, unlike them, wings it. We heard, and I believe, that he doesn't read the briefing books. He has supreme confidence in his own ability to wing it. So it's like stream of consciousness press conferences, and that's new.
We've been victims, if you will, of a blizzard of lies from day one of this president, except that I get the sense that the blizzard has been treated as something merely inclement weather.
Yeah, that's a great metaphor. I think that's a metaphor. I think we've become inured to it. The fact that there have been, by the Washington Post's count, 20,000 lies and inaccuracies since Inauguration Day 2017 kind of dulls the senses. And it still amazes me that 43% or 44% of the American public believe the president's version of reality. But again, if my book does anything, I think it puts into perspective the idea that partisan journalism is in fact part of the fabric of American history, that presidential reliance on his party's version of the truth has been animating presidents since Andrew Jackson, well, really since John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. Washington was stunned by partisan journalism, but Adams encouraged the Federalist version of the truth. And Andrew Jackson hired major editors to serve in his cabinet, in his informal kitchen cabinet. He made a journalist postmaster general, and they talked about keeping anti-Jackson newspapers out of the US mail. We think that this fight over partisanship in the post office is new. It isn't. This is all part of American tradition. We had a 70-year period where we kind of relied on objective journalism, and then cable news brought us rushing back into, back to the future or back to the past.
You talk about the tradition, and you wrote during Washington's time, readers expected their newspapers to be political, and of course they were.
They were. Well, Washington was sort of taken unaware. So he, this is a man who was unanimously elected by the Electoral College, had never been criticized in the United States. And all of a sudden, in the third year of his first term, his own Secretary of State, Thomas Jefferson, induces an anti-Washington editor to come from New York to Philadelphia, relocate in the capital, and produce an anti-Washington newspaper. And Jefferson, and remember, Jefferson is in Washington's cabinet. He just didn't think there should be one-sided journalism. He also hires him in the State Department at the exorbitant salary of $200 a year. So he would have some subvention to be able to afford the relocation. So the government is financing the anti-government publication. And that was the beginning. Washington was infuriated, deeply hurt. He was observed throwing a newspaper on the floor and jumping up and down on it in a cabinet meeting. And when he leaves, and he issues his famous farewell address, which is really a newspaper article, not an address, he makes it clear, at least in the first draft, that he's leaving in part because of the malevolent and malignant newspaper criticism.
Yeah, well, you cite that, and I was interested that Washington uses a classic rhetorical device that, at least in Latin, is known as praeteritio. I'll pass over without mentioning. And what he passes over without mentioning, while of course mentioning, is a real screed against the press.
Yeah, but Alexander Hamilton, who would soon found a newspaper of his own, and a pro-federalist newspaper, the New York Post, or the New York Evening Post, as it was first called, tells him to edit out that paragraph because it's too self-pitying. So we don't have it in its final form, but we do know. See, I don't think Washington left office because he wanted a two-term limit and he wanted to establish a president. I think he left because he was sick of being accused of stealing money from the federal government, which is one of the charges against him, or conducting himself like a king. He was outraged by it.
Let's get back to Lincoln, whom you know as well as anybody in this country, having studied him. He ran into what you refer to as brutally personal attacks. One newspaper calling him the Illinois ape, and he I don't know if that's threw him off balance or what. How do you see it?
Well, he was from the milieu of very partisan politics and very partisan journalism. After the first Lincoln-Douglas debate, the pro-Republican Chicago Tribune wrote that Lincoln was carried off in triumph by his supporters. The pro-democratic Chicago Times wrote Lincoln was so weak and exhausted that he had to be carried off by his superiors. So that's, he was used to it. But what was different is that when the war began and Democratic newspapers in the border states started arguing for secession, he had them shut down. He had their printing presses carted away. He had newspapers put in prison, some dragged from Missouri all the way to New York to be in Fort Lafayette in Brooklyn Harbor. And he also exercised the same kind of censorship on New York papers, on Philadelphia papers. If they criticized re-enlistment and later the military draft, they were subject to being shut down without trial, and the editors imprisoned without trial. So the Lincoln administration is the worst persecutor of the press, the argument being in a rebellion, you can suspend the writ of habeas corpus, you can crack down on free speech. But the Lincoln administration and the Army together shut down more than 200 newspapers during the Civil War.
And he engaged in I guess what we would call a disinformation campaign about, to the press, to the public, about the Emancipation Proclamation. He was going to couch it in very different terms from what it actually was.
Yeah, he was very worried about white reaction. It was being issued right in the beginning of the congressional campaigns, the off-year election of 1862. That was when it was announced. So he wrote some kind of disingenuous letters to the New York Tribune, which, by the way, he released to another newspaper first to stick it to the New York Tribune for criticizing him. And he said he was only doing it to save the Union. And I think he also met a delegation of free African Americans in Washington and told them that the war could not have occurred without their presence in the country, and maybe it was time for them to consider colonizing to the Caribbean or to Africa, knowing that it could never happen. But
yeah, I mean, that probably Lincoln's least finest moment.
Yeah, and he had an AP stenographer with him, so he wanted that story out. And it's extraordinary, looking at the record, how many liberal newspapers congratulated him for the tone of that confrontation, which these people went back to their churches and their meeting halls and said, wait a minute, did we just get asked to leave after we've been here for 300 years and, or 200 years, or let's tell them we're not going, and they did.
Yeah. Well, under FDR, didn't he bar reporters of color from the White House? They weren't allowed to be at the news conferences.
It's extraordinary. Roosevelt had 998 news conferences in 12 years. And African-American journalists, or at least one, was not admitted until 1944, the year he was running for his fourth term. And the argument that his press secretary used was that there was only room in the Oval Office where the conferences were held for daily reporters and for wire reporters, not for the weekly press. And of course, the black press was a weekly phenomenon. They were very powerful, but they appeared once a week. And why did he use this excuse? Well, think of who he was. He was a great press secretary for FDR, but he was Stephen Early, the first person to have the title of press secretary. He was Confederate General Jubal Early's great nephew. So he was an
interesting man for FDR to have as a press secretary.
Yeah. By the way, he got in trouble in New York in 1940. I know it was just before you started covering these political events, Tony, but he was trying to get into a rally at the old Madison Square Garden, and a black cop said, "Where are your credentials?" Stephen Early had never been confronted by a black policeman. So he did what maybe a few racist Southerners were used to doing. He kicked him in the groin, and he was detained. And the black policeman saved FDR a lot of embarrassment when he said, "I don't care, I'm voting for Roosevelt."
I was surprised to read so many things in this wonderful book. I don't know if anything surprised me more than FDR had a rule, a regulation that almost nothing he told reporters for 12 years in the White House could be quoted without his permission. As they say in the sports, baseball shows, that this game cannot be disseminated without the express written consent. That's what FDR demanded?
Well, it began with Teddy Roosevelt. He held daily press briefings while he was being shaved in the Oval Office, and it was all off the record unless he agreed to put it on the record. Woodrow Wilson introduced formal news conferences, and he was a formal guy. It was all off the record. And by the way, Roosevelt could be as FDR could be as short-tempered with the press as Donald Trump is. He may not have said that's a nasty question, or that's a wise guy question, but there are occasions when he said, that's a stupid question, go stand in the corner. And so he would ridicule questions he didn't want to deal with. And yeah, it was just part of the culture that they were off the record. But if journalists would say, and I read the 1,000 transcripts, if the journalist would say, Mr. President, we really would like to go with that story, he would tell Stephen Early to mimeograph a press release, and it would go out if it was the story of the day that he wanted to go with. I know, as somebody who worked as a press secretary, I loved that atmosphere. Too bad it didn't continue, but it couldn't have held.
Well, you did all right with Bella and Mario.
I did all right. You know what? Somebody was asking me the other day, who do I rank as the worst press secretary in history? And I think that the current press secretary, Kelly McEnany, may be the worst because she can't say, I don't know, I'll check with the boss. That was what good press secretaries used to do. If we got a tough question from Tony Guida or Gabe Pressman or anybody, we would say, you know, I don't know. Let me check with Mario. Let me check with the governor. Or I can't discuss it. You know, it's just not on the record. I can't answer. What's the big deal? It served the interplay well, to be honest. And that's what's lacking now. The press briefings are circuses. They're gladiator contests of argumentation and advocacy, and they don't serve either the press secretary or the press well at all.
I mentioned at the beginning how presidents were deft at getting around the press. And of course, FDR famously did that with his fireside chats. JFK with television. Television elected JFK, and then I think you used the phrase, he weaponized it against them.
And he used the same producer who would put makeup on him the day that Nixon would not use makeup in that famous first debate where Nixon looked like he was passing out and growing a beard before the cameras. He used the same producer to set up his backdrop at the State Department auditorium, which is where JFK held his press conferences. None of them was at the White House, by the way. It's just something in our imagination that we think they were White House press conferences. And he did, he made them into theater. The press didn't like them at first. They thought, one journalist said it was like watching Kennedy make love in Carnegie Hall, which may have been a slight inside joke. But then when they got airtime and they became famous, they liked them more.
Let's get to Johnson, who was a president who loathed and detested the media, the press, but he yearned for their approval, I think you say. And it was a very, very conflicted relationship LBJ had with reporters.
Well, he was obsessed with the press. He had televisions running with the news the way Donald Trump does, except they were tuned to CBS, ABC, and NBC. He had a ticker, wire ticker in his office. He told Joe Califano, whom I interviewed for the book, you can't function as an assistant unless you have a ticker running in your office with the news. And Califano said, I don't need it. You're doing the ticker. I can just get the news from you. Johnson sort of thought it was amusing. He was brutal on his press secretaries. One of his press secretaries said Johnson expected to be on the front page every day with an official photograph that showed him from his good side. And half of the press supported him after Kennedy's assassination, but Johnson felt that the Eastern press never forgave him for becoming president, almost blamed him for his ascent because he was a rube. He was a shadowy figure. He wasn't an intellectual. And then Vietnam, of course, made it impossible for the press not to talk about the credibility gap. But Johnson, he pursued the press in grotesque ways.
You call it intimidation by exhibitionism. And I don't know if we can get into the particular exhibition that he seem to
Well,
prefer.
one I think is safe to talk about is that when Look magazine sent 3 guys over to do a look profile for lunch, Johnson said, forget the lunch, let's go down and do some swimming and have some drinks. And he said, are you afraid to see me naked? Come into this locker room. So they all stripped down. They jumped into a pool that was heated to about 100 degrees. Johnson liked hot water swimming. And they frolicked there drinking. Johnson was drinking bourbon. And the press secretary said, what should Pierre Salinger? What should I get these guys? He said, get them scotch. They're Yankees. That's all they drink. And by the time these guys got out at 4 in the afternoon, they had had no lunch. They were completely blotto. And they had been treated to a complete Lyndon Johnson display. As I say in the book, it gave new meaning to the word look, a look profile.
We can't leave the discussion without mentioning Richard Nixon, who, as you say, was the first president to use press prejudice as a campaign theme.
Which we see recurring, don't we?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, I mean, he sent Spiro Agnew out on the road almost as soon as his presidency began to denounce the nattering nabobs of negativism, by which he meant liberal newspapers like the Times and the Post, and this crazy new thing where experts would gather on television and comment on things. They didn't like that. We don't, just give us the news, no commentary. So Agnew became the vanguard, the spearhead of this anti-press campaign. And Nixon had hated the press since the Alger Hiss days when he thought he wasn't getting the praise he deserved for exposing Alger Hiss.
For 16 years, ever since the Hiss case, you've had a lot of fun. A lot of fun. You've had an opportunity to attack me, and I think I've given as good as I've taken. But as I leave you, I want you to know, just think how much you're going to be missing. You don't have Nixon to kick around anymore.
I come before you tonight as a candidate for the vice presidency.
And from the days of the Checkers scandal, when he had to pay for television time to defend his innocent-sounding now slush fund.
Yeah.
And then, it devolved into an enemies list, and anti-Semitic, racist rants that we say, we don't understand how Trump can boldly do what he does. Why would Nixon tape these screeds constantly? And of course, this all gives rise to the kind of journalism that seems after Nixon to be dedicated in part to exposés, to kind of gotcha journalism. Every reporter, I think, since Watergate has dreamed of being Bob Woodward, where you get to bring down a president, you get $20 million book deals, and you get to be portrayed on the screen by a famous actor. It's extraordinary that 50 years later, it's still Bob Woodward doing the same job.
Yeah. Well, I think you wrapped up that thought you just mentioned there with the idea that the press after Nixon became a lot more aggressive and the nation a lot more cynical about the press and the president.
And if you look at surveys now, Tony, I mean, every institution that used to command respect has declined in the public mind. So we're all paying a civic price for the decades of cynicism. And it's hard to know how we get out of it because, once again, the press is, at least the television press on cable, is intensely, if not admittedly, partisan.
With regard to Nixon, just wrap it up with I loved your inclusion of the quote from Helen Thomas, the great UPI reporter forever, White House reporter Helen Thomas, who was asked, when did you first know Nixon was lying? And she said, 1946.
That's when he ran for Congress for the first time.
For the first time.
I use her as a recurring character after Kennedy because she is so insightful and tough. And of course, she imploded later over her anti-Israel public stance, which she began espousing as a journalist once she left UPI and became a columnist. But she had a long, long run, and she didn't take any guff from anybody. In Bill Clinton's first week in the presidency, he nailed shut the door that led from the White House press room to the press office. And boy, she was furious. And she let them know about it. She let D.D. Myers know about it, George Stephanopoulos. And it created a sourness that I think made it difficult for Clinton to emphasize any of his achievements and inspired them to focus on problems. And when I interviewed Clinton for the book, he's the only president I talked to about the press. He said it was a big mistake.
You start the book raising this 2 or 3 really important and cogent questions. One of them is, does the battle of the White House versus the media protect democracy or threaten it? Have you reached a conclusion on that?
Well, I'll let Thomas Jefferson do the statement, ask whether it was more important to have a free press or a government. He said it's more important to have a free press. But when he was president, he cracked down on newspaper criticism. He just encouraged states to put people on trial for libel. He became so angry that he allegedly ended his life not reading anything in newspapers except the advertisements, because he said those were the only things you can believe.
Carol Holzer, it's always a delight to chat with you. This book, The Presidents versus the Press, a spirited read, delightful read, and I thank you for this. It's good to see you.
Thank you, Tony. It's good to see you even remotely, and thanks as always for having me on.